Baroque England will be much like Renaissance England in that we'll see a combination of influences from various international sources. Via prints, trade, and itinerant craftsmen, the English will become familiar with the original Italian Baroque style, but more important, like all European courts, England will be greatly influenced by France, who is now leading the world in design. And that influence will be quite direct due to the Protestant craftsmen fleeing religious persecution in France for safe haven in countries like Holland and England. One of these will become court designer to the King and Queen of Holland, William of Orange and Mary Stuart, who, due to a complex set of political circumstances, will also become King and Queen of England. There, we'll see the result of these influences mixing with characteristics we already associate with English design, as well as a new and increasing appreciation of their very own Inigo Jones. Before we look at William and Mary's palace in Holland, though, just a quick reminder of the palace and grounds of Versailles. The gray stepped form I'm pointing out at the top is the palace with the gardens behind. Here, the Palace of Hetlo in the Netherlands, and though a much smaller scale, I think you can see the similarities with Versailles, which are due to the work of the court designer. Daniel Marot was a French Protestant, or Huguenot, who had been working at the court of Versailles until 1685, when certain laws protecting religious freedom were revoked, causing many like him to emigrate, a phenomenon that increased the spread of French influence throughout the West. Just a view of a tiny slice of the gardens at Versailles to compare to Hetlo. Here, even nature was subject to the control of Louis XIV. Here, an interior view of one of the public rooms along an enfilade at Versailles. Rich, impressive, and grand in the Baroque tradition, but also tightly controlled in the French manner. Notice the emphasis on geometric forms. And compare that space to something similar at Hetlo. Here, an example of the kind of prints that were helping to spread French style, this one a Daniel Marot design. And an example of an English state bed. Though designed by the French Daniel Marot, this style, with the frame carved and painted to match the fabric, will become typical of English Baroque bed design. A bedroom at Hetlo, very much in the style of Versailles, but without the low balustrade separating the bed from the room. In 1688, William and Mary assume the throne of England and relocate to Britain. While Marot accompanies them, there is of course no lack of great talent in London. The architect Christopher Wren, who had already designed a large number of important buildings in London, such as St. Paul's Cathedral, was court architect and engineer, and in that capacity was engaged to add to and renovate sections of the sprawling complex that is Hampton Court Palace. At that time, the primary royal residence, it was begun in 1514 and had a long and colorful history, added to by subsequent monarchs from Henry VIII on. Before beginning his designs, Wren spent several years on site at Versailles, watching the work proceed and soaking up all he could in terms of the latest fashion in palace design. Here you can compare the two facades. The main difference, noticeable right away, of course, is the pediment. And where did that come from? Why is that there? If you said due to the influence of Inigo Jones, who was in turn inspired by Palladio, you would be correct. A detail of the actual facade communicates other decidedly English elements, such as the brick. I don't want to spend too much time analyzing architecture, but I do want to make the point that at this time, circa 1690 to 1700, the influence of Inigo Jones and Palladio were on the rise. On the interior, we see further evidence of this in the pediment over the doorway, which is part of the general English taste for architecture as ornament, also quite visible here, that we learned about during the Renaissance. Do you remember anything else we learned about at that time in terms of English design preferences that is also featured here? On the next page, I listed the characteristics. Of course, monarchs are not the only ones concerned with expressing power during this age of absolutism. Other great wealthy noble families also built new houses or renovated existing structures in significant ways. England is famous for having hundreds of such great houses, many really more like castles. And Blenheim, begun in 1705 for the first Duke of Marlborough, is one of the most famous. While no one at the time could match the grandeur or scale of Versailles, in the entrance facade above and the garden facade below, you can get an idea of the importance of imitating that sense of power and greatness, as well as communicating something also particularly English, the respect for Inigo Jones. Here a view of the plan, just FYI, so you can get an idea of the scale of the building, though nothing close to Versailles, still quite impressive. The saloon, as it was pronounced then, after the French salon, which had replaced the great hall as the public center of the house, again embodies characteristics typical of the Baroque era, which by now should be familiar to you. But I do call your attention to the two great shells at the keystones of the arches, a form that will remain a favorite English motif throughout the 18th century. And another of those English constants, the preference for natural wood. Here, an enfilade at Blenheim, all in natural wood, compared to the one I showed you from Paris last night, gilded, the French preferred treatment for carved wood. Finally, a look at a more modest English country house, but one that contains so many typically English and typically English Baroque characteristics, I didn't want to pass it by. It also gives me the opportunity to provide you with a quick summary of the story of these famous houses, listed below the image of Sudbury Hall. On this page and the next are two views of the interior of Sudbury Hall, which are not only typical of English Baroque on a level a bit less magnificent than Hampton Court Palace, Blenheim, and others, but they're also very English in general. You'll see the points that I've listed for you. Before looking at some furniture, one last look at another of these famous houses, which is itself famous among these houses for a unique feature that is totally English and completely Baroque in its technical virtuosity. This is a view of the Long Gallery at Petworth House, and as you can see, the wood paneling has been left in its natural state, reflecting that English love of natural wood. But all the ornament you see there is carved in relief by hand by a man whose talent is renowned in the annals of design history, Grinling Gibbons. On the next page, you can see an example of his work up close. Astounding, breathtaking, and yes, awesome, even today. This preference for natural wood will, of course, also be reflected in English Baroque furniture, as you can see here. And like the French, the English will become highly skilled at working in veneers. This so-called seaweed marquetry is typical of English Baroque veneer, and in many ways is not unlike French boule marquetry, a light filigree-like pattern composed in swirling, moving compositions that are contained within a frame of some kind. The cartouches on this chest-on stand are filled with seaweed marquetry. I list some of the other Baroque characteristics of that piece here for you to identify within the piece itself. Walnut, both solid and veneer, was the most commonly used wood in England at this time, and here are some of the most familiar grains. These patterns are caused by deformities in the tree. The veneers are sliced either from areas containing irregularities of some kind or at the point where the branches meet the trunk, for example. They can then be assembled into a sheet of veneer. Tiger maple obviously is a different species, but was also a favorite for the dynamism of its pattern. Various combination pieces like this one developed now in England and remain popular through the 18th century. And as in wood carving, marquetry patterns of fruits and flowers were also quite popular. Just as an aside, some of the words in blue you've already seen, some will return, but do not. Various combination pieces like this one develop now in England and remain popular through the 18th century. And, as in wood carving, marquetry patterns of fruit and flowers were also very popular. Do make note of the words in blue. Some of them you've already seen, some of them will come back again, but they are important to know. A chest on stand with dynamic oyster veneers and legs that combine regular ball turning with diagonal barley twist. Very dramatic, very Baroque. As I mentioned last night, by 1680, trade with the East was in full swing, and that influence, in terms of materials and patterns, was picked up by cabinet makers who not only invented their own kind of lacquer, but also their own kind of exoticism, creating bizarre but charming scenes and creatures adopted from those they saw on imported objects. More formal kinds of cabinets like this were real imported Chinese lacquer cabinets that were mounted on domestically produced carved and gilt wood frames, usually in the French manner. This one silvered, clearly modeled on the famous silver furniture from Versailles. A sample of small tables and a chest, the English and Baroque characteristics of which should be clear, but also note the French style table, which is gilded and very similar in design to the base of the preceding cabinet. English Baroque chairs. If you can't tell what makes them Baroque on your own, refer to the list I've supplied you with here and see if you can match those words to actual characteristics you can point to in the chairs. Here, some with caned seats and backs, showing Eastern influence again, and the famous wing chair with bold and swirling ears, arms, and crest. This chair form had existed earlier, but only comes into its own now. The next few images provide a quick look at how the Baroque style in England, that is, the William and Mary style, was translated by New Englanders, who were, of course, still part of the nation of England. I won't comment any further as this is all pretty self-explanatory and the two styles are very similar, but do let me know if you have any questions. Bye!